Good morning. My name is Maggie Rivas Rodriguez. Today is February the 13th, 2017. I'm in Austin, Texas, interviewing Al Kauffman for the Voces Oral History Project. Thank you, Mr. Kauffman, for letting us interview you for this project.
My pleasure.
And we're going to, just so I have it on tape, if there's anything you don't want to discuss, that's your right. You don't have to discuss anything. If there's something you want to discuss and I'm not asking you questions, I know you will feel very free to ask, to interrupt and make that known. If at any point you need to stop the camera to get a drink of water or for any other reason, we can do that. And I had said earlier, this interview will be housed at the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection.
Wonderful. Mm-hmm.
So some of the questions I'm going to ask you are things that you've written about, but because we might be ending up using this in a short video documentary or something, I'll be asking you some just so we have you on tapes talking about it. So can you tell us a little bit about the Edgewood case?
Well, the Edgewood case was the Texas school finance case, and it was based on the allegation that the school finance system treated poor districts very unfairly, that low-wealth districts didn't have nearly the funds that they needed to educate their children, and other districts had not only more money, but lower tax rates to do it. So it was part of almost a national trend. There have been cases in many states around the country, and the Edgewood case was Texas's case in the state courts. And the Texas Supreme Court found that the school finance system violated the Texas Constitution and required tremendous improvements in the system.
So what were how did race figure into the Edgewood case?
Well, race was clearly one of the reasons why the system developed so badly, because the districts that were most harmed by the system were heavily Mexican-American districts. They were in West and South San Antonio, they were along the Texas-Mexico border, basically all the area of the border area. And I think that's one reason why the districts were allowed to exist on such poor funding, because there was an attitude in the state that these Mexican-American students were not able to learn more, were not able to progress in education, and also they didn't have the political power to make sure the system was set up so they could get the money they needed.
So in the journal article that you wrote recently, you talk about how the Edgewood case taught you all MALDEF, because MALDEF was representing the Edgewood?
Yes. In the Edgewood case, MALDEF represented low-wealth school districts and families in low-wealth school districts. And then there were also a lot of other districts that joined in. And then in the LULAC case, MALDEF represented LULAC and the other organizations. So in each case, MALDEF was the lawyer for the plaintiffs. And some of the same theories and philosophy and history basically educated us about the cases.
So one part of that you talk about is how even though the case was won, there still is not a good funding formula for poor school districts. And you talk about how it was because there really wasn't, while the case was being litigated, there wasn't any way, there was no movement to get some kind of an option, an alternative to the funding formula. And so can you talk about that, the lessons that you all learned through Edgewood that kind of wised you guys up so that you could not repeat this again?
Well, I think it was one of the major lessons we learned. In Edgewood, there was a great battle between the low-wealth districts and the high-wealth districts, low-wealth districts versus the state and the high-wealth districts. And early on, we were just fighting the battle. We weren't really thinking too much about what solution we would try to come up with if we won the battle. Because the normal structure of these lawsuits is the plaintiffs file a lawsuit. If they can prove their lawsuit and win the lawsuit before a court, then there's a remedy stage. And the state always has the first option to come forward with a remedy that meets the standards of the law. So to some extent in Edgewood, we figured as long as we won this lawsuit, the system was certainly going to improve. And by the way, it has improved some. I mean, there's still major problems with the school finance system, but the lawsuit was one of the major forces behind the improvements that have occurred. But still, there's problems with it. But in the LULAC case, which involved higher education along the border, we thought early on that if we won even a temporary battle, if we won even a lower court decision, we tried to get a political solution early. try to get all the people who might be interested in the lawsuit to come up with a common plan. Because again, back to the Edgewood lawsuit, in the Edgewood lawsuit, there were different, obviously, there continue to be many different interests. There were extremely low wealth districts who had a lot of poverty and a lot of English language learners. There were extremely low wealth districts that didn't have that many poor students and didn't have that many English language learners. And then there were middle wealth districts that were afraid they were going to be hurt by the system. And there were even high wealth districts that would benefit from some remedies and not from others. So all those interests were there. Very difficult to get all those people together. And so in the Edgewood case, we really didn't get together and sit around a table and try to talk until after we had won the initial battles. In fact, I think it was really after the first Supreme Court win in 1989 that we got a coalition of districts, high wealth, low wealth districts, all the education organizations, et cetera. Now, I don't pretend there was any one solution that could have satisfied all these people in the public school finance area. It's much easier to do it in higher ed because all of the universities and all the communities along the border area suffered fairly common problems. And so it was easier to get them together. But the lesson I think we learned was to start on the remedy early, not wait until you win a major court battle and then try to get all of the different interests involved together.
So was that a function, not having that remedy kind of sitting around the table, was that a function of the way MALDEF's offices worked, or was that a function of there wasn't someone kind of keeping a bird's eye view and watching this and saying, hey guys, we really probably should be thinking about this?
I don't think it was too much about MALDEF internal policies or politics. I really don't. I think it was just very different situations on the ground. I mean, in each case, MALDEF wanted to win the lawsuits, so financed the lawsuits, had the lawyers do them, worked with the plaintiffs. I don't remember in either case having someone who was, superior in the organization say, well, you ought to look at a remedy, or you ought to do this, you ought to do that. It was just like, what do you need to do to win this case? It's a big major case. So I think that the MALDEF internal structure was not the major factor. A lot of it just was the politics of Texas and the different geographic areas and the different interests we were involved in the two cases.
Okay. What do you think, so when the idea started to kind of bubble up about, okay, so we got a victory in Edgewood, what's kind of the natural progression, the higher education along the border, how did that bubble up?
Well, MALDEF would constantly receive complaints from citizen groups about, we need this, we need that, we're discriminated against in this way, we're treated badly in this way, we don't have what we need. So all of us would hear about these issues for many years. Higher education was something MALDEF had worked on, but not as much as public school work. So, but still, we had been involved in a major higher ed discrimination case in Texas. Texas was part of a national effort to try to desegregate public higher education, and both for African Americans and for Latinos. And MALDEF was part of that, sort of representing the Latino community, starting back in the late 70s, early 80s. So we've been hearing a lot of complaints about it, but to be honest, we spent our time on the public ed case because that seems so immediate, and there's so much pressure on it, and we thought it was something we could do something about. It was tractable in a way, we could do something about it. Now, in the higher ed case, though, we still got a lot of complaints, but they were two different types of complaints. I mean, one was a group of complaints saying that Latinos are discriminated against in admissions to the major universities like the University of Texas at Austin and Texas A&M College Station. And then at the education level, at student level, but also in employment, very few Latino professors, very few Latino administrators, very few Latino programs. So and that were complaints we heard all around the state, from Amarillo to Beaumont to El Paso to Brownsville, common issues among the Mexican American community. We also heard another set of complaints, and that was that our universities in the border area are simply not up to standard. We don't have the major research universities. We don't have the access to programs. We don't have good scholarships. We don't have good buildings. Basically, the higher education along the border was suffering as compared to the rest of the state. So two different groups of complaints. We decided to join them together in one lawsuit, and when we wrote the Lulak v. Richards lawsuit, we had both parts of this equation. One part of it said that the border area was underfunded compared to the rest of the state, and the second part said that Texas continued to discriminate against Latinos in higher education in all of its aspects: admissions, graduation rates, employment, and staff.
So, but the ones that the Mexican Americans in Permian Basin, how would they be affected by this?
Well, now the Mexican Americans in the Permian Basin would not be affected directly by this finance lawsuit, but they were affected by the other policies. So so that's why the lawsuit included both. We were fighting both for students trying to get into UT and A&M and faculty trying to work at those places, as well as around the state, and also for the border area. But certainly, Latinos in the rest of Texas were not directly benefited by the border region case. I mean, they were, as a community, all of us were benefited, but as far as people in Permian Basin or Dallas or Austin or Houston, they were not the direct beneficiaries of the higher education lawsuit.
So was there pushback from those communities and those legislators?
You know, I heard a few comments from now and then, but not very often. I mean, there were some Latino communities in Dallas, Austin said, well, you know, on the school finance lawsuit, you're representing Latinos all over the state, as well as everyone all over the state. But in this case, you're just focusing on the border area. But I didn't hear that very often. I think most people understood. Most Latinos in the rest of the state had some connection to the border area or understood where the major concentrations of Latinos were and where they needed funding. So I didn't get a lot of pushback from those other communities. I'm sure there was some resistance in areas, but it wasn't a really strong pushback.
So help me understand this, because as I recall, by calling it that it was the border university, and it wasn't Mexican American explicitly, but the fact that it was Mexican American largely Mexican American populations on the border, that's how race entered into that. Is that correct?
That's right. The state of Texas never created the border region. I mean, they never said that here's the border region and you'll have one university, and here's the Central Texas region, you'll have another. So the universities developed through the years, a long, sometimes sad story about how they developed, but they developed through the years. So it wasn't a defined area. Now, it's different than the school finance lawsuit because the school districts are creatures of the state. I mean, state law created them, and each district basically just answers to its own population within its geographic confines. The border area is very different. I mean, a university in Brownsville could accept students from all over the state or the country or the world, and so could a university in Austin or College Station or Beaumont or Amarillo. But the difference is that the reason why we said it was a Mexican-American discrimination issue is that if you looked at the record, it was clear that areas that had Latino populations, high percentage Latino populations, were continuously underfunded, and they didn't get the universities. And there was an attitude in Texas that these places needed public ed, or they need to learn how to speak English before you worried about getting PhD programs. And that was an attitude among many in Texas, no doubt about that. So that's why we thought, well, what area does this really affect? And it is the border region, even though it wasn't defined by the state. What's the border region? Basically, it's all the areas that are 150 miles from Mexico. We basically define the area as roughly all the counties that were within 150 miles of the Mexican-Texas border. Those also, of course, were the areas of the highest concentrations of Mexican-American students and Mexican-American population. So that all fit together pretty well. The fact is, I used to say, it's maybe not true as much as it used to be, but almost. If you took the center of San Antonio and you looked south to Tierra del Fuego, every area was majority Mexican-American. Every census tract from central San Antonio to Tierra del Fuego. I mean, of course, there was Latino. There's of course Brazil too, but in general, all of those areas are Latino, and all of the area along the border is Latino. And everybody in Texas knew that. The people in Austin who passed the bills knew that. The governors knew that. Everybody knew that was the Latino area of the state. There's no surprise in that. So every time a decision was made, and we went back and traced the decisions back for 100 years, almost every time the decision was made, it looked as though the border area got what one of my witnesses called the huesitos, the little bones, compared to the rest of the state. So I'll just give you one example. There was money for a new medical school in Texas, demand for a new medical school. And the major competitors were El Paso and Lubbock. And Lubbock got the medical school. El Paso didn't. But Lubbock didn't have enough patients to support a medical school. So they actually had to send their third and fourth year students to El Paso so they could see enough patients and they could learn how to be doctors. But still, they got the medical school, they got the first 2 years, they got the buildings, they got the faculty, and El Paso basically provided them patients. So that also happened University of Texas. University of Texas, every time there was a new program, University of Texas would compete for it and get it. They'd have a Center for Mexican American Studies before there was a Center for Mexican American Studies anywhere along the border. And this consistently happened over the years. The University of Houston got programs the border didn't. A&M got programs the border didn't. Dallas, University of North Texas, Texas Women's University got programs the border didn't. So it was just a clear pattern over time. And that's why we thought that we had a good lawsuit there.
So part of this is political leverage. Because I think you said that there were always legislators that were trying to push for more equality, and they weren't able to. Why is that? Why would the border lawmakers not have the leverage that somebody in a Dallas or a Houston or even Lubbock would have?
Well, first of all, the Lubbock case is pretty interesting. Lubbock actually had the governor at the time. So that was one thing that helped Lubbock get the medical school. The border area is about 20% of the population of the state, has roughly 20% of the state reps and senators, but has never had the political power, maybe until recently now. There's the speaker from San Antonio. Never had the political power the rest of the state had. And in the higher ed world, I think often even the legislators were underinformed. The senators and the state representatives, they would know about their own institutions. They would know that Corpus or Brownsville or Edinburgh or Alpine, El Paso, Laredo, San Antonio were underfunded, but not that the rest of the area was. So I think it's a combination of those two things. And also there was a little bit of a internal fighting, which any area has. I mean, Dallas-Fort Worth has had a major war for years. But there was always a little bit of jealousy, and I think the institutions like in Austin, College Station, exploited this to some extent because they knew that there was a lot of competition between Corpus and Laredo, and between Corpus and Brownsville, and between Laredo and San Antonio, and between San Antonio and El Paso for which area was going to develop the fastest, which was going to be the gateway to Mexico, which was going to be the place that's going to get the new this and the new that. So that internal competition, I think, sort of retarded the overall development of the area too.
What do you think could have been done to create a greater awareness? Because you mentioned that it's not just the lawmakers, but also the communities themselves. They had no idea that the same problems that they were having in Brownsville, they were also having in, Edinburgh, or which is fairly close. So what was the reason for that people weren't connecting the dots?
Well, because the universities tended to be very focused on their own towns, their own cities, their own counties, rather than on the area. And sometimes there were efforts to expand the vision, but not too often. For a long time, Texas A&I University used to be called in Kingsville, was the only public university south of Austin. So they became de facto the Latino university. So people from the Valley wanted to go get a graduate degree, went to Kingsville. People from Corpus went to Kingsville. Laredo went to Kingsville. Everybody went to Kingsville. That was it. Now, over time, other places developed, and each community, understandably, was dedicated to its own institution. So Brownsville people supported what became University of Texas Brownsville. Edinburgh supported University of Texas Pan Am. That was in Edinburgh. Corpus Christi supported what used to be Texas A&I. Corpus Christi became Corpus Christi State. So there was a lot of understandable, because their schools were so underfinanced, underfunded, and lack of programs, they fought for themselves, understandably. And I think one of the benefits of the lawsuit, I think, was that we tried from day one to make sure that everybody understood that it really was a common problem. Now, there were some people who knew this. I mean, we didn't have unique knowledge. People who'd studied the border for a long time knew some of these issues, et cetera. But I don't think there'd ever been the focus on it. Now, some of it started before the lawsuit. There was efforts in the late 1980s to bring funding to the South Texas area. And there was a committee chaired by Senator Truan and Representative Eddie Cocounsels, trying to focus on what do we need to do to bring more funding to South Texas. The issue was, though, that did not include San Antonio and that did not include El Paso. But still, there's no doubt that that area suffered common problems and had common needs. So to some extent, we created this lawsuit. We really wanted to look at it more broadly. I mean, San Antonio is really part of the old Mexican-American part of Texas, no doubt. It might be developing differently now, but that's what it was. I mean, it was the capital of Mexico twice, I think, in its history of a state. So it was the capital of Tejas y Coahuila, you know, so it had a lot of history. So I think we didn't feel we could do the lawsuit and not include San Antonio and El Paso. And also, politically, when you exclude San Antonio and El Paso, you also greatly decrease your numbers of state reps and senators. So when we got to including San Antonio and El Paso, you had an area with 20% of the population and 20% of the state reps, 20% of the senators, all behind you. So I think that for those reasons, we really felt it was important to do. And I think as we developed this, there was more and more of an understanding.
So this is a little bit outside, but what kinds of public education, and I don't mean schools, but I mean educating adults on how to connect these dots, what would that look like? Can you imagine?
Well, a lot of that was using existing resources. I mean, we tried to create committees in each one of these cities to talk about it, and each time we had the local state rep and senator sort of say, who are people who are leaders in the higher education area? Also, MALDEF, because of his long work in these areas, had a lot of contacts in these places. Like, I used to represent school districts in El Paso and Laredo and the Valley and San Antonio, so they knew people in higher education. So we worked with some of them. We did a lot of one-on-one educating, small group educating, and then we worked with the media a lot. We found that obviously that's one way to get the word out on these issues. But as I said, we built on a lot that was done by the South Texas group, the Cocounsels Truan group, as well as there was a professor at Pan American named Ted Von Ende, who had done a wonderful study looking at the South Texas area, which he roughly defined as Laredo to Kingsville to Corpus to Brownsville, and how they compare to the rest of the state. And he did a lot of the original work on this.
What was the role of the Tomas Rivera Center in Texas Rural Legal Aid? I wasn't clear on that.
Well, when we started the case, Tomas Rivera Center was, of course, dedicated to Latino education, had been for a long time, and they had several scholars from University of Texas at Austin. Ricardo Romo worked there, and David Montejano worked there, and Jaime Chain worked in San Marcos, and they were interested in it. So they were very involved with Tomas Rivera Center, and so they wanted to work with us on the lawsuit. And Texas Rural Legal Aid has lawyers all throughout the border area, and they were interested in helping us as well. So I think Tomas Rivera Center is not, of course, not a litigation group. They were not a plaintiff in the lawsuit. They're not lawyers, but they are students of higher education and experts at higher education. So they did a good job trying to convene us all to meetings to talk about these issues over time. And I remember we had a big meeting in San Antonio at Trinity University, and they pulled that together. So I think that was their major involvement.
You know, when you talked about, did MALDEF recruit organizations? How did the actual lawsuit come about?
Well, you know, MALDEF doesn't formally recruit. No, it's okay. It's okay. I mean, no, it's all right. Actually, law reform organizations, nonprofits have a greater ability to go out and talk to communities and say, this is a major problem there probably needs to be a lawsuit, and we happen to be here, than other groups. In fact, a U.S. Supreme Court case on NAACP doing that. And MALDEF had worked a long time with LULAC and GI Forum and community groups. So when we began to research it, we talked to them to see if they were interested in pursuing it, and LULAC very positively was, and so was GI Forum. So they became our major plaintiffs. We also work with TACHE, Texas Association of Chicanos in Higher Education, which is a group of Latinos, in higher education, both professors and staff administrators. And they, of course, knew the issues very well. Again, they knew their campus issues very well, not as well the statewide situation, but they understood generally what was happening in higher education finance. And so we worked with them over a long period of time, and they wanted to join it. Then we needed to find, just in a lawsuit like this, you want to have a wide variety of plaintiffs to represent different points of view for what they call standing purposes and things like that. So we had individual students who couldn't get into one of the major universities and ended up having to go to school in their local areas and not having as good a program. We had other students who could get into the larger university, couldn't afford to go, again, because a lot of people are what they call homebound, in effect. They have families, etc. And our Latino populations tend to be statistically more likely to be in the situation where they couldn't leave home, they had a family, or they couldn't afford to go off to Austin or College Station or Lubbock to go to college. So all of those groups together. So we had individuals, we had the groups like LULAC and GI Forum and TACHE, all together. Now one group we did not have, and I think that have been very hard to do, although some higher education lawsuits actually have other universities as plaintiffs. So the fact is that what used to be called the University System of South Texas, and that was the 3 universities in Laredo, Kingsville, and Corpus, and the Pan American University, which was Brownsville and Edinburgh, they were 2 different systems before we filed this lawsuit. They could have been plaintiffs. We felt that it'd be difficult to have them do that. They'd expose themselves to a lot of retribution, but I think there was a lot of sympathy from those institutions toward the lawsuit because they knew basically we were trying to help them.
The universities joined in?
They did not. They could have.
Oh, I see.
I said in some states, other states, there are other like statewide desegregation cases where the historically black universities joined in as a plaintiff.
So it was the communities, not the universities that were.
Well, now in our case, it was the communities, not the universities. The universities were not parties. In fact, they were defendants. So we had the Pan American University was one of the defendants in our lawsuit, even though everybody knew we were trying to help them. The University System of South Texas was one of the defendants, although again, everybody knew we were trying to help them. Of course, the major defendants were the University of Texas system and the the Texas A&M system. Remember, when we filed this lawsuit, the UT and A&M systems didn't have any universities south of San Antonio. They sort of, I call, bought them later. 2 years after the lawsuit, University of Texas took over the Edinburgh and Brownsville campuses, and the A&M system took over Laredo and Kingsville and Corpus Christi. That was in 2 years after the lawsuit. And I think to some extent the lawsuit was one of the forces that led to those mergers. They called them mergers, but I call them sales. But okay.
Do you think that's a negative, that they ended up being merged?
No, I think long term was probably good for them. Yeah, I do. I don't think that was a negative. In fact, I claim some of the credit for it. I will say this, that those university systems have been there for 30, 40, 50 years, and UT and A&M had never thought of buying them before. Okay? So I think the lawsuit convinced those universities that they needed to have more outreach to the border area. Also, the politicians did too. I mean, people like some of the people we're going to talk to, Chuy Hinojosa from the Valley and Eddie Cavazos and Carlos Truan and Judith Zaffarini, all of them were legislators in those areas who were pushing the universities to be more involved in the border area. So it wasn't just the lawsuit. But historically, as I said, when these other university systems started, UT and A&M showed no real interest in merging with them or dealing with them.
So you say in your journal article that also they lost control by going with these 2 major systems.
I think they did. I mean, as I said, Pan American University had the two campuses, Brownsville and Edinburgh. If they had stayed as their own university, I think they maybe could have been more aggressive during the lawsuit, trying to make sure that we won the lawsuit. They didn't fight against us really, but they could have been strong allies, much stronger allies. Same thing with the university system of South Texas. I mean, Laredo, Corpus, and Kingsville. They wanted us to win. I mean, I'm fairly sure they wanted us to win. But because they were part of a larger system, who was our major defendants, they really couldn't express that. So that's what I meant. I think that if they had had that control, they might have been able to do that. Now, I think long term it has been beneficial to those universities to be part of the larger systems because the universities have more money, more lobbying power, et cetera. But within those systems, they still had to struggle. I mean, the people from San Antonio and El Paso and Brownsville and Edinburgh have always had to struggle to get the resources that they had in Austin and Arlington and I guess Permian Basin, those areas.
So now I guess there's a merger of UT Brownsville and Pan American, right? UT RGV.
Yeah, that's just the last few years. There were separate universities of the UT. They've gone through 4 or 5 different name changes and structural changes, but it was basically UT Brownsville and UT Edinburgh. And in some legislation
Pan
that
American,
occurred.
right? Pan American?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, UT Pan American at Edinburgh. So, but they were UT at Edinburgh and UT at Brownsville. Pan American, I think it was UT Pan American, which was at whatever. Anyway, those two places are part of the UT system. I think, and I don't know as much about the development of this as I used to know because I was involved in politics in the past, but I do think that Dr. Francisco Cigarroa had a great deal to do with this effort to get a medical school in the border. One of the issues we had in our lawsuit was that except San Antonio had a medical school, but there's no medical school anywhere else in the border. So, and it was an area of tremendous medical needs and needs for medical education. So I think that Dr. Cigarroa and probably the people in Brownsville and Edinburgh and the local senators and representatives got together and said, how are we going to do this? Because they know the physical situation of Texas. They were probably not going to be able to create a whole new freestanding medical school in the border. So there was an effort to bring them together. So UT Rio Grande Valley started and it joined Brownsville and Edinburgh, and part of it was the new medical school, UT Rio Grande Valley Medical School, which, by the way, I've just read about is going to be one of the few, if not the only, truly bilingual bicultural medical school in the United States, as it should be, being on the border. I mean, if those of us who spend a lot of time along the border know about the special medical problems, the diabetes rates, the tremendous damage it's caused to be surrounded by pesticides their entire lives. My own wife's family has had more cases than you can imagine of breast cancer because all the girls were out there, when the planes came by, dropped the pesticides, they were breathing that stuff in, and so they've had 3 breast cancer cases out of 6 girls. So that's not unique in the valley. There are lots of cases of the children born without spines, because of the terrible atmosphere. So anyway, back to my point. Sorry, the medical school was needed, and finally, because by joining these 2 schools together in Edinburgh and Brownsville, and putting in the medical school, they've created the new university.
Can you, and I'm sorry that I'm moving around here, but you talked about you had some of the parties that you got involved were some of the students that either weren't able to go to school or they ended up, not being able to afford it or they couldn't move there. Can you remember examples of some of those stories?
Well, it has been 25 years, or 28 now, I guess. So let me see what I can remember. Several of them got admitted to schools in the rest of the state, but couldn't afford to go. And there was a woman who lived in, I went actually to pick her up for her deposition. She lived in a colonia outside of Brownsville. And, parents had absolutely nothing, and she could not afford to go. She was admitted to one of the schools, couldn't afford to go. We had other students who were not admitted to schools in Austin or College Station, but did need to go to their universities locally and did not have the programs that they needed.
Which were like what?
Well, the interesting. The border universities didn't have doctorates in Spanish. They didn't have advanced degrees in border studies. They didn't have advanced degrees in all sorts of medical areas, pre-med as well as medical schools. A whole range of science, math, majors and masters and doctoral programs were available nowhere in the border area. I mentioned the Spanish one because I think it's particularly frightening. If you've been in El Paso, from University of Texas at El Paso, you can see Mexico. Brownsville, the University of Texas at Brownsville is literally right on the river. You can see Mexico, but you couldn't get a doctorate in Spanish at those schools, or Laredo. But by the way, they had doctorates in Denton and College Station and Commerce in Spanish. So it was just, these things affected these students, lack of opportunities for them. It also affected the communities, because the fact is having a university, of high-level university community, is a tremendous advantage for the economics as well as the education of the communities.
So, so some of those people that weren't able to afford it were with the new systems. Were they able to afford them now? Do you know that?
Well, a lot of them still couldn't afford it. There have been more scholarships available to UT Austin and A&M through the years, although I don't think the lawsuit had much to do with that. The major thing, the way the lawsuit benefited those students, is that if they were going to go to university in the border, they had much better programs available. So students even in San Antonio that want to get a doctorate in education can get one in San Antonio now. They don't have to go to Austin. Students in Brownsville and Edinburgh who want a doctorate in education or in business can get one in the border. They don't have to go up to Austin or to College Station or to Houston. So that's the major benefits it's been for these students. There were some scholarships. There was some money for scholarships and loans, but basically that was at the border institutions rather than at the other institutions to attract border students. It was at the border institutions to make sure they could afford to have students attend those universities.
So the folks that were included in, you say that the legislators were named as co-counsels.
Mm-hmm.
What was the strategy behind that?
Okay, well, actually I learned that from another lawyer who worked on a case and had legislators as co-counsel. I think he had worked on a case for farm workers, and he had some legislators as co-counsel. So I said, if there's ever been a case where legislators could be good co-counsel, this would be it. So it turned out that of the, I don't know, I guess it was 25 legislators in the border area and 5 or 6 senators, that about 10 of them were lawyers. So we talked to them and said, would you like to join as co-counsel? And they all did. So Senator Uribe was one, Gregory Luna was one, Chuy Hinojosa was one. I've forgotten the names of all the others, but we had about 8 to 10 of them who were lawyers in the state legislature from the border area to join as co-counsel. And I thought it was helpful because they would be involved in the lawsuit from the beginning. We communicate with them from the beginning. And also maybe the state would take it more seriously if they said, well, it's not just MALDEF or a few lawyers down there. It's we've got people who are involved with our appropriations who are lawyers. And I thought it might be helpful. So now they were co-counsel, but they didn't participate in the trial. I mean, there's different types of co-counsel. But,
so they were just basically the
they
name
were
was
there.
attached.
They were named. Their names were attached. They were co-counsel, but they were not involved with the trial. Didn't call witnesses. Didn't do discovery. These lawsuits going on now by, there's states all over the country that sued Obama on DACA and DAPA. Okay, most of those states did nothing. They just signed their names on, and then a few states led and did all the work, and that's basically what happened.
So, as you were doing your research into the issues, you found out the funding formulas that privileged the 2 state universities. Mm-hmm. You found out that there were the lack of programs, the difficulty in establishing programs. What to you was the most striking or surprising of what your findings?
Well, the PhD one was the easiest to explain. the fact that there were no PhD programs in public universities in the border. There were 2 or 3, and there were 600 in the rest of the state. That was, to me, is basically the most shocking. The part of it that I think explains it best was the funding system. And a president of a university along the border, I'm not sure I want to out him now, but he explained this to me. I went to see him and I was sitting in his office. He said, "Al, let me show you how this thing works." And I was really surprised when I learned about how the funding system works. And basically the funding system of universities ties in past discrimination. In the law we call it, present effects of past discrimination. But basically the system gives much more funding to expensive programs, high-level programs, to masters more than bachelors, and to doctors more than masters. So those universities that had the good programs, that had the advanced programs, that had the advanced degrees, got much more money from the state than the other universities. So that basically tied in the discrimination. So I'm sitting here at the University of Texas right now, so I will dump on my host. I think the University of Texas did what most people would do. They had tremendous amounts of funds because they had doctorates in electrical engineering and physics. Those programs paid 10 times as much per student hour as a undergraduate program in physics, as a first-year program in physics, and about 50 to 100 times as much as a first-year program in education or English. So they had funding coming in. Because they had funding coming in, they could use that to parlay themselves into major programs getting more lab space, more extra research programs. They could go to the legislature and get more special programs. They could say, look, we have a PhD in engineering program. We have Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones is the best in the world at doing this sort of research. All we need is an extra $10 million to develop a new lab and a new building to do this research. It'll be good for Texas. It'll be good for everyone. And people said, good, that's great. And so they expanded their funding. The university on the border had nothing to work with. They only had enough money basically to pay for their buildings and pay for their faculty and maybe buy a student center from time to time or build a building from time to time, and that was it. So that's the part of that I didn't know. I mean, I saw the effects of it. Border didn't have it, rest state did. Knew that, but I didn't know why until people explained the funding system to me so directly.
So that college president who explained this funding formula, how did he feel about it?
He thought it was unfair to him and discriminatory against the students in the border area. And but of course he worked for a system, and he couldn't really go out to the newspaper and say that. But I mean, I don't think he wasn't telling me any inside secrets. I mean, it wasn't like attorney-client privilege or something. He was telling me something that people maybe in higher ed knew, but not too many people knew. And even the legislators didn't really understand this. Remember when the legislators every 2 years get together, they pass this gigantic budget, and they look at it and they say, well, okay, the budget has $40 million for Brownsville and $80 million for Edinburgh and $400 million for Austin and $350 million for College Station. And they'd ask why. They said, well, this is generated by the credit hour system, which is an objective system. They say, okay, well, I understand that. So, because they were trying to be objective, and indeed the system is classically objective. And that is, if Brownsville had had a doctorate in nuclear engineering, every credit hour there would have generated as much as a doctorate in nuclear engineering at UT Austin. But they didn't have it in Brownsville, so it didn't matter. But on the other hand, their first year English class generated as much for each credit hour in first year English in Brownsville as it did in Austin or College Station or Lubbock. So it was a theoretically objective system, but everybody knew how it worked. And then getting new programs, that's also how, I mean, I don't mean to get off too much of this. But I also learned how you get new programs. There was a regulation, it was a rule of the State Board of the State Higher Education Coordinating Board, that they would not give a PhD program to any university unless they had more than one PhD program. Because basically El Paso and Kingsville had one PhD program, so they couldn't get any more. So you had to have more than one to get more. And to get a PhD program, you have to go through, again, a quote objective process. You have to show that you have the library books, the professors, the programs, the labs to support the program, whatever it is. So the border universities didn't have this. They didn't have anything they could use to sell a new program. So they didn't get the new programs. So those two factors are really what led to the continued disparities and the continued discrimination.
A sociologist would say that this is classic structural racism. Y'all never use that.
You know, I love my sociology friends. I guess I think the shoe fits. It was structural racism, but I just see it was a system that was built on a discriminatory system and then continued it. And part of it was out of ignorance and part of it was out of intent. I mean, I do think that people in our state really didn't feel that the folks in the border area were ready for higher level education programs. I mean, they felt you need to have a school that's going to educate teachers, not to pick on teachers here, but it's going to educate teachers and business people. So you could have programs in education and business. They even allowed them to have some master's programs in education and business. But there was a strong feeling that these universities and their communities were not ready for advanced programs, advanced sciences, and doctoral programs.
And the state repeatedly said things like that you need to start at at the bottom so that you can build that up.
That's right.
How did you respond to that? How did MALDEF and you personally, your own feelings about saying, well, we can't have these programs, we can't have these greater funds because the folks wouldn't be able to take advantage of them because their grade schools are not reading at the same levels as somebody in Plano.
Well, my answer was, first of all, you don't know the people in the area. They're able to do it. That's the first answer. But the second area is you have to work on all these issues at the same time. I mean, I think you need to work on public education, more funding from pre-K through postgraduate. All of these areas, the state needs to put some more resources into them. And if you waited for the border area to have as high graduation rates and as high average SAT scores as the rest of the state, they'll never get the higher education programs. So you have to start. You have to have some seed money. And that's what this South Texas Border Initiative did. It basically gave us the seed money, the new money to start new programs, to hire the new faculty, to build the new buildings, so that then you could attract the better programs and develop them. But if you let the system go as it was, you would never break the system. So that was my answer to them.
So I guess that Judge Euresti got some pushback for his actions on that. The jury had found that, it looked, to the outsiders, it looked like the jury had said, this is really, there's not this is kind of a justifiable inequality. And then the judge turns around and says, I differ with the jury.
Well, that's really, and that's not quite what happened. I mean,
Okay, well, tell me.
I teach Texas civil procedure, so you have to believe me on this one.
Okay.
The jury found that the state had discriminated against the border area and not given access to a university of the first class. The jury found that the state had created an inefficient system of higher education. What the jury did not found against us on was they did not find that individual members of the Board of Regents of University of North Texas purposely discriminated against people in the border. So the way the question was framed is why we lost it. I mean, the system did discriminate. What they found for us on all of those issues. They just found that individual members of the Board of Regents didn't discriminate, and that Ann Richards didn't personally discriminate. So, in fact, we did win for the jury. What the judge did then was he gave us credit for what the issues on which we did win and gave us a judgment. And that's perfectly consistent with Texas law. Judges do it all the time. You win 3 issues, you lose 1 issue, and the judge can still enter you a full judgment if you've earned it and if your findings support it, and ours did.
Did you know Judge Euresti before?
No, I didn't. I had never met him before he took over the case. Now, the previous judge in the case was a Judge Gilberto Hinojosa, who is still an active political person in Texas. And I had known him before. I didn't know when it got into his court, what court it was going to be in. It got into his court. Well, I did know him before. But in Texas, that's very common. Lawyers know judges all the time. I mean, go out to lunch with them and meet them and go to political events with them, so that's not unusual. But I mean, I had no sway over Judge Hinojosa, but Uresti I'd never met.
So was his idea, Odesti's idea, to call for the questionnaire?
Call for the...
He had there was a questionnaire that the jurors had to answer.
Oh, okay. Now that's not an idea. That's
Okay,
that's
tell me.
Texas procedure.
Okay.
Texas procedure requires you to have a jury charge.
Okay.
And if it's a jury case, and the jury charge asks questions of the jury. That's the questionnaire. So, and there's been law in this Texas for 150 years. So, and lawyers get together and fight over what question should we ask them. So, basically, the judge here, Judge Uresti, he used some of our questions and used some of the defendant's questions and put them all together. But that's normal procedure. He had to ask the jury these questions. And as I said, the jury answered the questions about, is this an inefficient system of higher education? They said yes. Did they deny the border region access to university first class? Yes. Did they deny the law school that tried to start in the valley a chance to get developed? Yes, they did. But then they said, did these individual members of the Board of Regents and individual political officials purposely discriminate against the Latinos on the border? The jury said no. So to some extent, the questions that we, the plaintiffs, recommended, the jury said yes to. The questions that the defendant recommended, the jury said no to, because they obviously wrote questions that they felt the jury would go with them on, and they did. And we asked questions we thought the jury would go with us on, and they did. But now all of us was in the pleadings. You had to allege these things, you had to prove them, and the judge found there was proof for us on all these issues.
In '93, the Texas Supreme Court reversed the earlier decision, right?
They did, uh-huh.
And you don't go into detail in your journal article about that, except that you think that my understanding was that they misread what the case.
Well, I mean, I did describe the opinion. I had several pages on it, actually. But they basically found that the judge's judgment was inconsistent with Texas law. And so they reversed it. And that was in 1993.
But did I misread this? That it sounded like what you were saying is that they had not read the case correctly?
Well, of course, I mean, lawyers who lose often say that, and I said it too. I still don't think they ever really understood the basic theory of it, and as a lawyer in the case, it's partially my fault. I didn't make it clear enough. But they saw it as a case saying that the border region, as a region, had certain legal rights. And we never argued that. We said there was the Mexican Americans in the border region had legal rights, and that they were the ones that were discriminated against. They also said, and they were correct about this, that the border region was not defined by the state. In other words, the state didn't send money to the border region based on that region. They sent it to universities based on their programs. I thought we had proved that the reason why they didn't have the programs was this discrimination, and we clearly did not convince the Supreme Court of that.
You talk a little bit about the challenges to keeping up the advocacy for the border universities, that it kind of fell by the wayside. What were the challenges of keeping up the pressure?
Well, to some extent, we developed this very strong coalition of communities all over the border area. And we had meetings. That's how we developed our plan, our South Texas Border Initiative. After the Supreme Court threw out the lawsuit, basically the lawsuit didn't have any more power. When we developed our communities and the community groups in each area and came up with the plan, to be honest, we had the wind behind us. We had the wind was in our sails, because we had an important court injunction saying that the higher education system could not be financed unless it was constitutional, and that it was unconstitutional. So that was an important power. After we passed the South Texas Border Initiative. Remember, that happened before the Supreme Court reversed the case. After we passed that, a lot of the energy behind that decreased because we basically got what we were asking for. And then when the Supreme Court reversed the judgment, a lot more of our wind behind our sails disappeared, went the other direction. So it became much harder to hold that coalition together. Also, to be honest, MALDEF staffed it free. I mean, basically part of our job, and we don't think we've been over backwards to be generous or charitable, part of our job was to develop this plan. We did it. After we finished the lawsuit, we moved on to other lawsuits. And the communities had to develop their own system, their own plans, and work together on their own. And it was hard to do that without the power of the lawsuit. Also, as I said, MALDEF had community contacts in all these areas, had worked with them consistently through the lawsuit, and there was no one else who had done that available to do it. So all that, I think, happened. Now, I think there's still informal efforts. I mean, I think that the university presidents in the border area, I mean, I don't know of any organization they have, but they certainly know that they have a lot of common interest. And I'm sure that they talk. And they see that if the formula system goes one way instead of another, it can help them or hurt them. And if the special items go one way or another, it can help them or hurt them. So I think that happens at the university level, at the high level administrators. But the community groups, really, that effort dissipated. And I mean, I'm partially responsible for that. We didn't go out and work it hard enough after we won the lawsuit.
You had a few other things on your plate.
I had a few other things on my plate, but that was an important one. We didn't do it.
What do you think was lost by not keeping up the advocacy?
Well, I think that the progress, a lot of the progress was made when we won the legislation in 1993 and continued to have effects. I think if the coalition had held together, I think we would have gotten the medical school in the Valley much earlier. They finally did develop a medical school in El Paso as well. I think that would have happened earlier and been better funded. I think there would have been a faster development of programs in the border area if the coalition had stayed together. But the major sort of quantum leap, I called it, was made in 1993.
How do you think that overall, I mean, I know that there has been, and I forget, but there has been a huge increase in doctoral programs, in different programs, period, on the border. They're all allied and they have more funding now. But for the communities, how has the lawsuit and then the border initiative, how has that changed?
Well, the community's been greatly benefited by the lawsuit. I mean, I think there should be a MALDEF building in each one of these universities, to be honest with you. But the University of Texas San Antonio had, I think, no doctoral programs, and now has something like 25 or 30, and they're focusing on science and engineering. That has been a tremendous attraction for businesses, for high-tech industries, the cybersecurity. You know, they have lots of programs related to community development. So San Antonio has benefited tremendously. The Laredo had 1,000 college students in Laredo. Now they have 10,000. And that has an immediate effect on the general level of education in the area, their ability to educate teachers for the area, to educate students for the area, to study the border region's trade issues, immigration issues. All of those things are now studied in Laredo instead of having to beg College Station or Houston or Austin to study us. They can study their own issues. So all along the area, I mean, the University of El Paso read an interview of Dr. Natalicio, who was a new president at UTEP when we did this lawsuit. I think is still there 30 years later now, 25 years later. She talked about the importance of the lawsuit to bring new programs, which enabled them to add programs, give more education to their students. They have more buildings, they have more scholarships. They can study the international relationships there between, I mean, Juarez and El Paso requires, of course, its own study center, needless to say.
Do you think it's had any effect on kind of the mindset of people along the border?
Well, you know, I haven't run any surveys on this, and I mean, I live in San Antonio and I have family in the valley. But I don't know enough to really say it, but I think it has. I think that all of these communities are much more proud of their local universities, more supportive of their local universities, and the people who live there know that if they want a higher education, they can get it there locally, and I think that is positive. And I have seen a lot of that just in my own family, people that live in the valley. El Paso, I've talked to people from El Paso. People in San Antonio can get the degrees they need in San Antonio. So I think all of these areas have been really benefited.
Okay. Okay, let me ask my students. Do you all have some questions, Linda?
Can I have a sip of my coffee?
Sure.
Are
Here,
you
wait,
wired?
I am wired, but
Okay.
I'll ask Linda.
Maybe somebody can bring it. I just
Yeah, they'll
get a little
bring it.
dry here. Should have brought a bottle of water here.
I should have thought of it. I didn't think of it.
I didn't either.
Hey, Linda, will you bring that cup of coffee to him? I will
Thank
remember
you.
that. I will remember that for
For Eddie.
Eddie. Okay. Okay. Great.
We're not on
Thank
tape
you.
now, are we?
We are, but we'll
Oh,
just
okay.
cut that out.
I was going to use his nickname again.
What's it? Oh.
Okay, sure.
Okay. Earlier, you mentioned that universities you thought sympathized with the case could have faced retribution had they shown support to the Corps. What exactly do you mean by that? What kind of retribution and from whom?
Well, okay, I think, let's say the president of UT Brownsville supported us in the lawsuit once they're part of the University of Texas system. That would have been biting the hand that feeds you. I mean, once you're part of the system, you're basically saying that your chancellor, the person over you, the person who can hire or fire you or get you hired or fired, was discriminating against you, and you're working against their interests. It would have been very difficult for any president to do that. And same thing with the A&M system. Once Kingsville, Corpus, and Laredo became part of the A&M system, they had to answer to the A&M Board of Regents. That's where their funding came from. That's where their programs came from. That's where their new officers came from. And they had to go through them for everything. It would have been very difficult to have strongly opposed your own system.
So where do you think the Board of Universities go from here? How can they continue to improve?
Well, they're making a lot of improvements. I think that they still need some big jumps. I think the medical school in the valley is very important, but it's not really funded at a high enough level. They're going to need a lot of new extra funding for that. They tried to create it without having what they call a large fiscal note, without having a large amount of money necessary from the legislature every year. And they're going to have to change that and get that money for it. The medical school in El Paso is there, but it's not funded at nearly the level of the other medical schools in the state, and it needs more funding. We have a new university now in South San Antonio, Texas A&M, San Antonio, and it's going to need a lot more funding to develop new buildings, new programs, et cetera. Because remember, again, people are wondering, well, why are there two universities in San Antonio now? Well, there were none there until about 1970, and San Antonio is a big place, and a lot of large cities around the country have 3 or 4 major universities in them. So we can certainly support that in San Antonio. Kingsville is in an interesting position. I mean, I could go over each one of the cities. I'm just saying that each one of them has a need. They have certain types of programs for which they need more doctoral programs, more buildings, more scholarship lines, more library and media holdings. So each one of those areas has great needs. Now, they're now 18% of the students are in the border. It used to be 13 or 14%. So I would like it where we're 20% population in the border and 20% of the students in the border. But those are the general areas where I think there's still challenges.
It's kind of interesting because, I often hear this about, Houston has enough universities. They don't need another one. And you go to some place like Boston where they have a ton of them, and it makes Boston that much stronger. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I was in Boston for several years, and there's about 20 there, I think. Yeah.
What do you think that the community needs to do to help lawyers to keep lawsuits to solve the problems that the public education is still facing today?
Well, I think public education still is underfunded in Texas to a great extent. And the Supreme Court recently found against the poor districts and medium wealth districts, said the system is constitutional. I disagree strongly with it, but that's what they found. That was just last year in 2016. Community groups need to work in each area they're in and make sure that their lawyers who are activists get involved in this process, and their legislators know about the needs. So legislators are interested in these areas, but they sometimes don't understand just how deep the need is for more funding for public ed and more funding for higher ed. So the community groups need to get together, organize their positions, and go meet with their legislators and meet with their senators and apply some pressure there.
Okay. In your article, you mentioned that few analyses of social state system reform focus on the interrelationship between legal proceedings and the community, advocacy, legislative dimensions, and other scholarship that leads to litigation. With that in mind, can you share a particular memory or encounter with a community organizer or activist that was memorable to you while working on this case?
Well, sure I can. And I think many lawsuits are based on real community needs. Some are based on what their lawyers think is necessary. So sometimes the lawsuits don't come as much from community pressure from the bottom as much as lawyers wanting it to do it. So I think that does sometimes happen. Now, our lawsuits are not the only ones that were community-based, for sure. There have been efforts to improve prisons, to improve mental health, improve child welfare agencies all around the country. So ours is not unique. But when you look at the literature, what's written about it, most of the cases talk about what the judge did, like Judge Justice, who I loved. Judge Justice did this, Judge Justice did that, but don't focus as much on what sort of community pressures were there on the lawyers and on the judges in the case to get those things done, and how did the lawsuits affect what happened at the community level. I think the fact that when we developed this lawsuit, we based it on a lot of community meetings and community involvement, I think really did help us structure the lawsuit. And by the way, I still, people got very involved in it. One of the programs that was recommended by the Laredo community was a program in merchandising, a master's or a PhD in merchandising. And this was recommended by a community group there in Laredo. We added it to our plan. Well, there was a woman in Laredo who I know very well, like a lot, who is still very upset with me that they recommended merchandising for Laredo. So Laredo doesn't need merchandising. You know, we need to talk about capital formation. We need to talk about international business. We need to talk about physics and math and neurobiology. So she hasn't forgotten it yet. So I mean, those sort of pressures were important. So I think, but being more related to community is much easier for us to find out what they truly wanted, rather than just having some lawyers say, well, here's what I think you need. Because that sometimes does create a disconnect between the real community needs and the lawsuit itself.
Because it was not just meeting with individual communities, then all the communities got together to
yeah, that's right.
talk
When
about.
we developed our plan, we had community groups from Brownsville, Edinburgh, Kingsville, Corpus, Laredo, South San Antonio, North San Antonio, Alpine, and El Paso. I think I included Laredo in there. Anyway, and Del Rio. We had groups from all of those areas, 5 people, and they all met in one room to try to come up with our plan. And I think it was important. I'm not going to say that was a perfect democracy. There's no way you could have 50 people or 75 people in a room and try to come up with a perfectly rational plan. But it did force them to talk about, well, if you have this in Laredo, we're not going to get it in Corpus. And if you have it in Kingsville, we're not going to get it in Laredo. And if you have it in San Antonio, we're probably not going to get it in Brownsville, and vice versa. And I think having all happen earlier was very important. We had the state legislators, state senators were all involved in the same room. By the way, the person I had moderated was Henry Cisneros. And we had lots of good battles there. Tony Sanchez and Carlos Truan almost had a fist fighting over whether Laredo or Corpus was going to get a certain program. But once we worked through all that, we did have everybody behind the plan. And then that plan because it was developed so much from from the grassroots, developed up, was highly respected, and people were tied into it. And when we talked to the state leaders, when we talked to Ann Richards and Bob Bullock and Pete Laney, we actually got support from them because we were a unified group. And we could go in and say that people from Laredo and San Antonio and Corpus, Brownsville, El Paso all agreed to this. And I think that was very helpful to us.
Okay, very good. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you'd like to add?
Boy, well, you've been pretty thorough here. Yeah, I think that I think what you said, needs to happen in the future. I hope that San Antonio and El Paso become real Tier 1 universities. They're trying to become that. They call themselves top tier universities, and Tier 1 university is sort of a word of art developed by the Carnegie Commission, defining different levels of universities. And I think that it would be very good for the whole border if those two areas had that. And also the Valley. I think with UT Rio Grande Valley, with the medical school and universities, should have as a goal to have a true Tier 1 university. And what does that mean? It means you have professional schools, a broad range of doctoral programs, the master's programs and undergraduate programs to support it, as well as the buildings and the faculty to support it. And I would hope that the other areas in the border would also get those programs.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Al
Thank you.
Kauffman. We
My
really
pleasure.
appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.